Clara was born in London on May 12, 1869. She was the sixth of 8 children of Thomas Holder and Maria McHugh. Thomas Holder, who had served in the Crimean War, became a farmer, then joined the police. In 1870, when Clara was a year old, the Holder family left England for Ontario, Canada, where Thomas found employment in a railway workshop in Allendale, near Barrie. Clara's childhood was marred by poverty and domestic tension. Her father, a Methodist, and her mother, an Irish Catholic, constantly argued over religion. At the age of 16, Clara left her unhappy home, marrying William Allen Davis in Toronto on December 24, 1885. Yet happiness eluded her. In close succession, she gave birth to a son, Allen, in April 1887, and lost her husband through an accident at work. A widow and the mother of an infant while still a teenager, Clara sought to support herself and her child by training informally as a nurse. She found it difficult, however, both to raise her son and to earn a living, especially after she became ill with typhoid and was unable to work during a lengthy recovery period. Reluctantly, she put Allen into the care of her eldest brother, Henry, a decision that, over the years, was to cause her continued pain. In 1902, she moved by herself to the United States, settling in Walla Walla, a town in southeastern Washington state, where she obtained work in a medical office devoted to the VIAVI treatment, a new and unorthodox approach to healing. In 1905, Hyde Dunn, an English Baha'i who immigrated to the U.S., met Clara Davis when he entered the medical office where she worked in Walla Walla, Washington, to post an advertisement for a Baha'i meeting that he were holding that evening. Following that meeting, Clara began to investigate the new religion and, sometime later, became a Baha'i. On accepting the Baha'i teachings, Clara found herself part of a small group of Baha'is in Walla Walla. Far from other centers of Baha'i activity, it lacked the strength to deal with demoralizing opposition from local religious leaders or to nurture Clara as a fledgling Baha'i. Alone, unable to spark interest in the Baha'i faith among her friends, and sensitive to criticism from those who called her a quack because of her commitment to the VIAVI treatment, Clara suffered a nervous breakdown. She could not work for some time and only gradually regained her health. In October 1912, when Abdu'l-Baha visited the San Francisco Bay Area for 18 days, Clara was so short of funds that she almost did not make the journey of some 1,600 kilometers to meet him. At last, she managed to borrow money for a train ticket. Arriving in San Francisco on the final full day of Abdu'l-Baha's visit, she found herself in a strange city with no clear idea of the address she sought. She followed the vague instructions she had been given and somehow managed to find the house where he was staying. The first person she saw there was Hyde, who had arranged to be in San Francisco for a week to hear as many of Abdu'l-Baha's addresses as he could. Although the time that Hyde and, especially, Clara spent in Abdu'l-Baha's presence was brief, he made an impact on both of them that lasted for the rest of their lives. After Abdu'l-Baha left San Francisco, both Clara Davis and Hyde Dunn carried out their activities as Baha'is with new dedication, Hyde living across the bay in Oakland and Clara in San Francisco. In March 1916, Hyde's wife, Fanny, died, having accepted the Baha'i faith shortly before her death. Over the next year, the friendship between Clara and Hyde deepened, and they married in July 1917. They lived in Oakland, later moving to Santa Cruz, and often hosted Baha'i meetings or spoke in the homes of others. The couple invariably rented a well-appointed apartment or cottage, rather than a simple one, to have pleasant surroundings in which to present the Baha'i faith. The remainder of Hyde's income was spent almost entirely on their teaching activities, on travel, Baha'i literature, and the food with which they served the many guests who attended meetings in their home. In 1919, Clara and Hyde read Abdu'l-Baha's call, in a series of letters called the Tablets of the Divine Plan, for teachers to take the Baha'i faith to all the countries of the world, traveling as he longed to do, even though on foot and in the utmost poverty, to promote the Baha'i teachings. Clara later recounted that she looked up from the page she was reading aloud to Hyde and said, "Let us go where Abdu'l-Baha wished to go," adding, we are almost in poverty." Hyde replied unhesitatingly, "Yes, we will go." They decided to set out immediately for Australia, where no Baha'is resided. After Clara suggested that Hyde might proceed alone to save the expense of her ticket, they cabled Abdu'l-Baha, asking whether both should go. He replied, "Highly commendable," thus settling the matter. Some of the San Francisco Baha'is expressed concern that an elderly couple, Hyde in his 60s, Clara 50, intended to travel so far to spread the Baha'i message. Hyde is reported to have replied that he would sooner die than not respond to Abdu'l-Baha's call. Following a sojourn in Hawaii, Hyde and Clara traveled to Sydney, landing on April 10, 1920. They were accompanied by Clara's son, Alan, who had joined them in Honolulu and remained with them for a time in Australia. "We arrived in Sydney with naught but faith in Abdu'l-Baha," Hyde recalled a decade later. Their lack of funds brought distress in the first few months. Both Hyde and Alan fell ill, and Clara, finding very little strength left in Hyde, hoped that she and Alan would be able to earn enough to allow Hyde to devote himself wholly to Baha'i activities. Fortuitously, Clara found work at the Viavi office in Sydney. Within the year, however, Hyde regained his health and obtained a position as a traveling representative for the Bacchus Marsh Milk Company, enabling Clara to give up her job. In the next decade, his work took him to every state and major city and town in Australia. Typically, when Clara joined Hyde in his travels, they would rent a cottage in the state capital. He would then travel to country towns during the week, while Clara remained in the city, making friends, involving herself in charitable activities, and inviting people to weekend meetings at which Hyde would speak. By July 1923, Hyde had visited 225 towns, an average of one new town for each 4.5 days of work from the time he started at the company. Despite the Dunn's efforts, progress in attracting new adherents was slow for the first few years. A turning point came toward the end of 1922. After Hyde and Clara had spent more than 2 years traveling and meeting scores of people, 2 Australians, Oswald Whitaker and Effie Baker, became Baha'is. At the end of 1922, Clara and Hyde, using a month of holiday time that he had accumulated over 2 years, traveled to Auckland, New Zealand. They were unaware initially that a lone New Zealander, Margaret Stevenson, had been a confirmed Baha'i for some years, holding the fort and waiting for reinforcements, as Clara put it in a letter to a friend in California. Clara observed that in Auckland their efforts to teach the Baha'i Faith achieved immediate success. "We seem to have done more in 2 weeks here than we did in Australia in 2 years." Although Hyde had to return to Australia, Clara stayed in Auckland until April 1923, nurturing the small band that became the nucleus of the Auckland Baha'i community. Clara and Hyde Dunn had complementary personal qualities that enabled them to become successful promoters of the Baha'i Faith. Clara combined a charitable nature with a gentle but determined manner. She often used her nursing skills to care for others. She gathered people around her and was able to rally them quickly to a just cause. Through her own suffering, she had developed a sense of compassion for those close to her and for others whose plight she came to know. Friends have described her as warm, humble but self-assured, graceful, serene, and fun-loving. Hyde had a friendly, outgoing disposition and a distinguished, upright appearance. He retained his English accent and spoke in an engaging and inspired manner, drawing people to him without ever seeming to be overbearing. Those who heard him speak were struck by the unearthly light that suffused his whole personality when he talked about the Baha'i Faith. With business acquaintances, Hyde was a keen observer of economic and political conditions. Nevertheless, he felt that, for want of training and technique, he lacked the ability to express himself fully, and he relied to some extent on the intellectual assistance of friends. In conversation and in correspondence with Baha'is, however, he was both confident and eloquent. He was especially enthusiastic in advocating the close study of Scripture. During the 1920s, the Dunns patiently nurtured individuals and fostered the growth of small and isolated Baha'i communities across Australia and New Zealand. Mother and Father Dunn, as the new adherents began calling them, guided the Baha'is toward establishing local governing councils, or spiritual assemblies, in preparation for eventually electing a national spiritual assembly. The first local spiritual assembly was established in Melbourne in December 1923, followed by Perth in July 1924 and Adelaide in December 1924. These assemblies lacked firm foundations and declined when the Dunns moved to another city. Subsequent visits were required to revive them. Assemblies established in Sydney in April 1925 and in Auckland in April 1926 proved to be stronger. Distinguished Baha'i travelers from North America assisted the Dunns with the process of gaining media attention and expanding the Baha'i communities of Australia and New Zealand in their formative years. Martha Root in 1924 and 1939, Siegfried Schopflocher twice in the 1920s and again in 1936, Keith Ransom Keller in 1931-32, and Lulai Matthews in 1934. Accounts of their travels appeared in various Baha'i publications, forging links between America and the Antipodes. In early 1932, Clare Dunn made a pilgrimage to the Baha'i holy places. There, Shoghi Effendi stressed to Clara the necessity of forming a national assembly in the Antipodes. This was achieved in 1934, with delegates to a national Baha'i convention coming from the Adelaide, Sydney, and Auckland assemblies. Hyde served on the National Spiritual Assembly of Australia and New Zealand during its first year. Shoghi Effendi had great affection for Hyde Dunn, to whom he referred in God Passes by as great-hearted and heroic. In the advent of divine justice, a long letter addressed to the North American Baha'is in 1939, he included the Dunns among a small band of distinguished North Americans who had won eternal distinction as the first Baha'is in a number of highly important and widely scattered centers and territories. Those who became Baha'is after hearing the Dunns speak numbered more than 100. They, in turn, assisted in firmly establishing Baha'i communities throughout the South Pacific. Such notable individuals as Greta Lamprell, Bertha Dobbins, and Harold and Florence Fitzner became Baha'is in the 1920s through Clara and Hyde Dunn, and later were designated Knights of Baha'u'llah by Shoghi Effendi for having been among the first to take the Baha'i Faith to gold countries and territories in the 10-year plan. Hyde suffered a stroke in 1935, but gradually regained his general health, although his eyesight deteriorated. He died in Sydney on February 17, 1941. In 1952, Shoghi Effendi posthumously designated Hyde Dunn a hand of the cause of God. Clara had always regarded Hyde as the better speaker, but after his death, the Baha'is turned to her and fully expected her to speak in his stead. Rising to the challenge, she invariably began her talks with a question often asked by Abdul-Baha: "Do you know in what day you are living?" In later years, her speech was suffused with supplication, as she frequently recited prayers aloud, including her favorite by Abdul-Baha that began, "O Lord, my God and my haven in my distress." When the National Assembly called for pioneer teachers to establish the Baha'i Faith in various locations at the start of a new phase of teaching in 1943, Clara settled in Brisbane for several months. Subsequently, she recommenced visiting major centers such as Adelaide, Melbourne, Hobart, and Newcastle. She always suspended her travels in late December and early January to participate in summer schools at the Baha'i property at Yarranbull, south of Sydney. Participants at many summer schools in the 1940s and 1950s were able to hear her recount how she met Abdul-Baha and tell of her many years of travel with Hyde. On February 29, 1952, Clare Dunn was among a contingent of 7 individuals appointed by Shoghi Effendi as hands of the cause of God. Well over 80 and growing increasingly frail, she gathered her strength to fulfill her far-reaching spiritual and administrative responsibilities. In 1953, at the start of the 10-year plan, Shoghi Effendi directed her to travel among the Baha'i communities in New Zealand and in Australia, where she settled for a time in Newcastle. She continued her travels attending an intercontinental conference in New Delhi. The following year, Shoghi Effendi named her trustee for the Continental Fund for Australasia. Clara carried out her tasks wholeheartedly and took direction from the hands of the cause of God residing in the Holy Land, who served as liaison between the hands and the continents and Shoghi Effendi. During this period, her tasks included acquiring sites for Baha'i temples and for national administrative centers, including one in Auckland and another in Suva, Fiji, maintaining current achievements, increasing the number of Baha'i centers, expanding the scope of literature, purchasing national endowments, incorporating assemblies, and establishing publishing trusts. When appointed as a hand of the cause, Clara Dunn lived in Sydney and traveled several times to visit the Baha'is of New Zealand. In April 1957, she represented Shoghi Effendi when the Baha'is of New Zealand held their inaugural national convention and elected their first national spiritual assembly. Physically fragile, Clara remained robust in spirit despite two major losses she suffered in 1957. First, her son, Alan, died. His troubled life had been a source of pain to Clara over the years. Shoghi Effendi sent his condolences and asked the Baha'is of Australia to make every effort to comfort and care for the mother of their community. Then, on November 4, 1957, Shoghi Effendi passed away suddenly. As he left no appointed successor, the burden of leadership fell upon the hands of the cause. Clara insisted on traveling to a meeting of the hands held in Haifa later that month. Although she was too weak to attend the sessions, she participated by signing several major statements that the meeting produced. In the following years, Clara played a dedicated role to her community in Australia and New Zealand to the extent her health permitted. She attended her last summer school at Yarranbull in 1959 and her last Australian Baha'i Convention in April 1960. Clara Dunn died in Sydney on November 18, 1960, and was buried beside her husband in Woronora Cemetery. The Hands of the Cause in the Holy Land, in announcing her death, paid tribute to her as a distinguished member of the American Baha'i community who responded to Abdu'l-Baha's call to take the Baha'i faith to the antipodes and who rendered unique, unforgettable pioneer service.